Hello and welcome to the Game Dev London podcast. I'm your host for the day, Gianluca Montague, and joining me is GDL host as well and industry veteran Oscar Clark. Oscar, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. It's so hot. We're recording on Friday the 8th, and it's currently 30 degrees in my office, and I'm not good with temperature. So I don't know about how you're doing, but I'm melting.
I relate to that heavily. Yeah, it's been a sweaty day, no doubt.
Let's just leave people with that thought. Yeah. So moving swiftly on.
Yeah, moving swiftly on indeed. So I thought we could talk today about monetization and about how to monetize games ethically and the different kind of structures that are in place there, and kind of talk around that topic, because I think there's a lot of differing views, a lot of contentious
A guy with a top hat and a curly moustache who looks just like a kind of classic, black and white movie villain talking about ethics. Is that what you're saying?
That is exactly what I'm saying. That's what we need. That's what we need.
We need more, cis white men talking about ethics.
Well,
I'm joking about, but I mean, obviously,
yeah.
There are people who know this is one of my main topics. I love talking about it, and and we were talking about a whole bunch of stuff. And I think this came up because of the conversation we're having. Was it only last week? It feels longer ago.
Yeah. A week or two ago. I think it was 2 weeks ago, actually.
We were talking about Baldur's Gate 3, and there was one of those conversations. Whilst the conversation was prompted by Baldur's Gate 3, I think we did very little talking about actually Baldur's Gate 3. Which I'm more than 120 hours into now. Anyway, I'm moving swiftly on. I just love those games. I have to do everything. Anyway, the point is that one of the things I think is still to this day, a lot of misconceptions. So I'll chuck a few stats at you. So right now, did you know that there's 78% plus, and I say plus because the last time I saw data on this was 2020, of revenue is coming from games as a service games, i.e. free-to-play based games.
So I didn't know that, but I believe it.
I mean, honestly, just when we're talking about the biggest games on the planet, the biggest form of digital entertainment on the planet is coming from free to play. And yet, still get to this day a lot of people very frustrated and angry about billing mechanisms. Some people who really hate microtransactions, some people who hate ads. And yet, they're some of the biggest forms of monetization available to a game developer. So how do we get this balance between, a good experience, an engaging, immersive experience, and using commercial models? And I mean, I don't know how do you feel? What's your kind of preference in terms of game mechanics?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm kind of fairly tuned into this type of thing because I come from a marketing background anyway. And so a lot of what I was doing historically in my previous career was very analytics driven and user focused, and like, what do we want users to be doing? How do we want them to convert into money or into a lead or whatever it might be? So with the ad, I'm not surprised, like I said, that 78% of revenue is looking at that kind of.
Well, 78. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's like nearly 80% of the market. I mean, Again, I bore Fringlon. I literally wrote the book, right there, and that's nearly 10 years old, and it still makes sense. I mean, again, I'm not trying to blow my trumpet, but if you think about this, right? So why do we're used to watching ads when we watch a streamer? We're used to watching ads when we watch. I think some people still watch live TV. I haven't for many years, but I think some people do. Some people still. I mean, I get accused of being a boomer. I am not. I'm a Gen X. I will die on that hill. But there are still boomers out there who still do it, and I think there are still some other people who still do it. But basically, we have the most sort of disposable form of communication, entertainment available, and games is such a pivotal part of that. But we don't shy about the fact that you've got to listen to ads when you're watching streams. We don't shy about the. You might want to buy a T-shirt at an event, or buy tickets to go to a show, or go to the cinema. Some people still go to the cinema. I still love going to the cinema, and I'll still pay for my ticket. I don't expect that hour's worth of entertainment or that 2 hours worth of entertainment is going to be free. And yet, games industry is able to offer hundreds of hours of free play. And what they ask for is, if you like this thing, pay me more. And the trouble is that there is a balancing act. And again, I don't know how you feel about it, but my feeling is that there's a lot of people who complain are either harking back to a ancient time, which I experienced, and I think a lot of them didn't, but that's maybe me being old, where you bought a game and you were excited by it and you played it and you owned it. And there is something about owning, which is lovely. But I also remember in that bygone age, we were putting 50p in a machine and getting 2 minutes of play, and then putting another 50p in to get the next 2 minutes of play.
Mhm.
And don't get me wrong, I do have a very fond memory of spending 4 hours playing Gauntlet.
Okay.
Genuinely, so we were at this is a true story. I was at for those of you who don't know, there's a holiday entertainment place called Butlins. I was a waiter, well, a venue assistant technically, but I was a waiter at Butlins in Skegness when I was 18. And the last day of the season, there was 4 of my mates sat around a Gauntlet machine, and all of the holiday makers were chucking in pound coins so we could all keep playing, and we carried on playing for 4 hours.
Wow.
I mean, to show you how bad we were, the fact that there was enough to carry on playing for 4 hours shows how terrible we were at the game. But that's not the subject. So I suppose the point I'm trying to make there is that money, the value is in the eye of the beholder.
Mm-hmm. I feel like there's maybe I'm being optimistic in saying that I think that most people, which is always the worst way to start a sentence, but I think that most people would not be. I think it's about balance ultimately, basically, and that most people are not inherently against the existence of advertisements in games. And I also don't think most people are inherently.
Yeah.
I think some people are definitely, like, at its foundational level, don't like microtransactions. I think that is true. But I think the majority are like, yes, it's fair. I think where the issue can arise is in when the ratio is not correct for how it's either presented to the player or what the player has to do to progress, and this obligation to feel like you have to invest in something that they were promised would be free to continue to progress. And maybe that kind of situation is where the kind of contentious situation actually occurs.
I mean, the way I try to describe it to people is that we're talking about player value. I mean, it's literally that simple. I mean, it's not. Obviously, I can call you forever on it. But if you think about it, if you don't put the first question shouldn't be the accountant saying how much money can we get.
Yeah.
It should be, why would people want to spend this much money? Because let's face it, we work for our money, but we get paid different amounts. We're in an economic crisis for a lot of people. Some people are still having to get food banks, and yet they're still spending money on a mobile phone game, for example. Why is that? Mm-hmm. Well, often it's not because of the specific. You can't compare it to like a cup of coffee. Mm-hmm. You kind of can as well, because it's like, what is that escape value for that person? And if you start understanding what the escape value for that person is, it starts transforming the way you look at this stuff. So game developers are making games, and what a lot of us who love making games, there's a difference between playing games and making games, and loving making games is a different feeling than loving playing games. By the way, you have to be insane to want to make games, but this is just me. I've said this on my podcast so many times. There's only one thing worse than making games, and that's not making games. And if you feel like that, you'll be fine.
You'll be
so if you think about this player value thing, right? So if we're going to say, let's take some of the bad stories, right? So we all know about Star Wars Battlefront 2. Why did that break? Well, I don't know the full details, but I understand that somebody different from the designer of the game designed how the loot crates were going to work.
Yeah.
And I suspect, and I don't know this, I suspect it was somebody who was more on the commercial. I'm going to say accounting. I'm probably not correct, but more of an accounting mindset than a player experience mindset. And I get that. I get how that happens. But this is exactly why things go wrong. Because as soon as there's a disconnect between what I expect to see as a player and what I'm paying for, that's when I think things get broken. And I think actually the correct response is people hate on the game.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the trouble is it casts a shadow. And when we see games like that, anyone who then uses the same model, even if that model is fair, gets laboured with the same
brush.
brush.
Yeah.
And often not necessarily honestly. It's being a bit unfair, but let me give you an example, right? Ben Cousins is a friend of mine who did the original Battlefield Online. He did a talk on this in 2011 at GDC. It was a fantastic talk. One of my. I mean, I'm still talking about it. It's lasted with me more than 10 years. It's ridiculous. So he was doing that, and this is the first time they put Battlefield Online into free to play. And so we had all of the community going, "You're evil, you're terrible, you're horrible, blah, 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 blah. You're just trying to get money. All you care about is money. You don't care about the game. Where's your gaming integrity?" You know, Ben's a good guy. He loves his game design. He loves his thing, but he's also commercial. It's his job. He's got to be able to make the next game.
Mhm.
And interestingly, the first people who bought all of the things were the people who complained about it. So this is why I say that people aren't necessarily honest about the difference between what they say and what they do is very stark. And often, if you're not somebody who understands that dynamic, you'll hear bad stories about particular games, and it will be very hard to tell which are legitimate and which are not.
Yeah, I see. That's an interesting. That is an interesting observation. I'm sure that that's still the case now, in terms of the loudest voices sometimes being the ones that I guess do the thing anyway.
Squeaky wheel gets the grease. Yeah.
Yes. But I do think that what you called out about how marrying with these kind of I don't even want to say alternative approaches to monetization, because I feel like really buying a game outright is just one type, and then there's about 10 others.
Yeah.
So when I say
let me dive into that one, right? So pay up front, okay? So there's an assumption that paying up front is good. Why? And I'll get my favorite example is always Duke Nukem Forever.
Okay.
Because Duke Nukem Forever cost me $34.99, and it wasn't just bad; it was terrible. They literally killed Duke Nukem Forever. So, was that fair? Was that reasonable? They presented a game that was not of merchantable quality, in my opinion, and I paid for that game. I took that risk, that punt, because I was a fan of the Duke Nukem franchise. I had lots of very, very fond memories of running an online gaming community for Duke Nukem 3D. We had such a laugh. I was running an online gaming service called Wireplay at the time. It's like the 98, 99, that kind of era. And if you think about it, that stuff was like really passionately loved. Of course, I'm going to spend the money because I love the brand. You know, yes, it's misogynistic. Yes, it's problematic. Blah 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 blah. But it was supposed to be a pastiche on that sort of 90s, 80s, 90s kind of hero thing. So, is it fair to produce a game that's not good enough and charge up front? I don't think it's inherently fair to charge up front compared to, say, charging in the game. In fact, I would argue, again, biased here, isn't it fairer if you get to play the game and then decide if you want to buy the extra stuff?
Yeah. I completely see that point, and I don't
but
think
it's not commonly shared, is it? I mean, it's that mental switch hasn't happened, and it's interesting to think about why.
I mean, I think the why is ultimately familiarity, most likely, and the knock-on effects which you described as like casting a shadow of enough. People clearly aren't thinking about all the bad times they bought something outright and it's been bad.
Yes, correct.
But they are thinking about the times when particularly larger titles have been released that are clearly predatory in terms of the way that they're monetized.
Yeah.
And they're shining that light on everything else that is using a similar model. But I think what you were saying was what I was going to call out was this marriage between how you choose to introduce whatever, whether it's microtransactions, ads, whatever, needs to be brought together tightly with how the game is actually designed, and player experience needs to be built into it. I find that I'm talking from personal experience as well as like some secondhand accounts, but particularly like ads. The only time people complain about ads is when they're not receiving a direct reward for it, and it's been thrown in their
Yep.
face.
Yep.
The moment you say you can choose to watch this ad, and if you do, you'll get X, Y, Z,
Da-da-da.
it's suddenly fine. So, I think, yeah,
It's fine to a level, and it defines the context. So, for those of you who don't know, I was the original evangelist for Unity Ads. So even before Unity bought the company that developed it, so I was literally at the start of that rewarded ad process. One of my favorite talks ever was with a guy called Matt Hall, who, if you've heard of Crossy Road, you'll have heard of Hipster Whale, and I genuinely love that guy. And he and I ended up having a chat in Amsterdam at an event called Casual Connect. Sadly, no one recorded it, but I still think it's one of the best chats we've ever had, because it was two designers talking about why they love games and how they use ads to not be awful. And I mean, I am calling myself a designer, but we were coming at it from that point of view. And so I don't like interstitial ads.
Okay.
Just so you know. So what is an interstitial ad? That's the thing that gets in the way of me playing. Now, there are times when that interstitial ad can be good. I'll give you a reason, right? So if you're playing a hyper casual game, a really small, throwaway, disposable piece of junk, but I mean, actually that's a bit unfair. It's just a disposable experience. If you didn't have the ad, you'd burn out.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of thinking. It's like, actually, what is the role of the microtransaction, the ad, the VIP package, etc., etc.? What's the role of it that's not about making money? And I think that kind of gets to the point where I think you're highlighting is, how do you discuss that? It's like, when you find the thing that makes it make sense to switch the model that works for the player, then we've got a good reason. And the trouble is that you can't actually sustain a game if you do a pay up front model. Well, yeah, ish. I'm being a bit unfair, but if you think about it, right, if you do the pay up front model, it's a bit like gym membership. What sustains gyms is that people spend their money in January to get a better body. By March, they've given up and they can't bring themselves to cancel
the,
because then they're giving up on having a better body by summer. So they're getting all of the money that they could have got, even though none of the people are turning up. And games are the opposite. We get the money up front and people keep playing it. And the longer they keep playing it, it's in our interest to get them to tire out. Because every day they keep playing, if there's, assuming it's server costs and stuff like that, it's costing us money. So how do you build a business model that aligns with the player experience? And if 78% of the world of the games industry is revenue coming from live ops games, if we don't have business models that align with the sustainability of the game, you're not going to get to play that game you love. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, I think there's a separate discussion to be had about. I mean, a lot of what I think. I mean, your comments on interstitial, those ads that for the word I can't pronounce. I think that totally makes sense to me, and that's kind of reiterating the point I was making anyway. Outside of ads, I feel like microtransactions is maybe a slightly different beast. I feel like I'm just kind of ideating in my brain now, like thinking about how I would incorporate ads in a way that I think is okay, and I get a lot of ideas. When it comes to microtransactions, that idea of providing value and making sure that value equates and ties into the player, the lifespan of a player and their experience with that title, feels harder to pinpoint. Depending on what it is. You can make a point for something like a one-time payment for like a season pass, right? That clearly makes sense. You're rewarding players who buy it with like significantly more value if they continue playing. So that makes sense for you because they're going to continue playing, and it makes sense to them because they're going to be rewarded for continuing playing anyway, and that's what they find fun. But for something like a skin, that leans into player expression, being able to flex, the equivalent of that, that type of thing. But clearly there is a threshold. What your point was like Battlefront 2, like loot boxes in particular, where your rewards are random or where they're overpriced, I'm assuming, where that no longer becomes okay for a lot of people. So, yeah, go on.
I have many points. So, one of the issues is when people just say, look at that model over there, let me just copy that, you often end up in trouble. Classic example is I always go on about this. It's really kind of silly, but I like the fact that I did 2 hours of consulting on Subway Surfer.
Okay.
And I mean, I all that means is I went, yeah, that's a great game, go make it, and they did, and they had 3 billion downloads, and they had a randomized payout item in that. They essentially had what would now be called a loot box.
Mm-hmm.
But it was delightful. People loved it. People spent a lot of money, were happy with it. You can't exchange the account for somebody else, so that may be one reason. But because one of the issues with this, so I think there's a lot of things being said about loot boxes, loot crates, whatever you're going to call them, that isn't quite right. Now, I'm not going to defend gambling-like methods to manipulate people's purchase behaviors. That's never going to be something I'm going to ever defend. But bear with me, trust me for a bit, assume goodwill. What I think you've got to realize is, what is the value? So if you think about the value for a player, there are what I call subsistence value. So, like I have to have health to carry on playing. You have like social values. You talked about like the skin, the flexing, that absolutely, that consumable social value. It's not consumer, sorry. That social value is really important. You also have what I call shortcuts. So, the power-ups and sort of stuff. Now, the reason why power-ups are interesting, and actually this ties really into well-designed rewarded ads, is a power-up is basically it gets over your designer bullshit. A lot of games you design, you forget that the players aren't you. They don't have your reflexes. They don't have your complete inherent knowledge. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they just need a bit of a hand. And well-designed shortcuts means that you make the game more accessible to more people. And then, in addition to that, you have strategy goods. Now, what I mean by strategy good is new ways of playing. So you might have the basic way of playing, but there are some additional ways of playing that only premium users potentially could have access to. Lots of arguments around that. What that means. Simple level could be, I have a shotgun, you have a machine gun. Okay. Now they do the same amount of damage per second, but the behavior of a shotgun is massive damage, weight, massive damage, weight. Whereas the behavior of a machine gun is damage over time, damage over time, damage over time. Okay. So they change your playing behavior. They don't make it pay to win. And we all know that pay to win is rubbish. Actually, there's no such thing as pay to win. It's called broken games. Now, but the other thing, they're the forms, but there's also types. So, like, we've got consumables. I can consume something, and now a consumable, either an individual like power up or maybe a bundle of resources I can then put into something, which allows me to unlock some recipe somewhere down the line. Great. Those things I don't have any problem with spending money on, because it's a choice between time and money. So there are lots of people out there who've plenty of time, and some people who have no time but reap plenty of money. The problem is, if you rely too much on the people converting time for money, you end up undermining why they're playing the game in the first place. Okay. But there's another thing, which is durables. So the things that you aspire to. You mentioned like, actually, I'll get into the VIP type stuff later, but imagine you want to have this amazing hat, the Hat of Wonder, right? So you want the Hat of Wonder. It is a aspirational item. But once I own it, I own it. Now, the interesting thing is behavior is this, right? I want it, I want it, I want it, I have it, I use it once, I forget about it. The value of the more permanent items, in terms of what players actually do, is that they want them, and then when they've got them, they're satisfied. Whereas the value of the smaller microtransaction items you're describing as inherently bad, I don't think are, because they actually turn out to be things that would turn out to be really useful at the right moment in time. The question is, how do you deal with capacity? So how many can I hold? How frequently they generate automatically for free? Those kind of questions are a different subject. So what I'm kind of getting to is, we often look at this as a very simple, like, we're going to do a microtransaction here. No. What is that value to the player? And how does that value get presented in a way that makes sense? Now, on a PC Steam game, I'm not going to be giving you a whole bunch of bundles of coins necessarily. I'm not saying never, but it's less likely.
Mhm.
I might give you a battle pass which unlocks more XP, and the coins in the game you get more of because of your XP increase, because you've got more missions you can complete. All these secondary benefits that then drive you playing the game more.
Mhm.
That feels much more comfortable to players, because actually what I'm buying is just ways of getting more out of the game more intensely, because I'm a more intense player.
Mhm.
So I don't know if I'm getting across. What I'm trying to get across is, again, back to the player value, thinking about this as game design.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I think I think that ultimately there are very few types of rewards, which is kind of what you were covering there, that are very few to none that are inherently bad. I think I don't think that it's what is being offered that is bad. I don't think that shortcuts are inherently bad. I don't think that I obviously paying for being better than other players in terms of actual in a competitive environment, just being able to do more damage is obviously going to, like, as you said,
Isn't that the juxtaposition there? Because I want the things that make me give more damage to the other person, but if I feel I haven't gotten through skill, do I feel like I'm cheating? And a lot of people do, and rightly so, I think.
Mhm.
The question is how do you do the banding of that? How do you make it so? I mean, I have a whole bunch of arguments on how to do this in a really smart way, based on a mod for Quake called Weapon of Choice, designed by a guy called Mark Smith, that doesn't get the credit it deserves, because the whole gun game stuff you see in COD and various other games like that comes from that. You know, I think Mark Smith needs a lot more credit, because he was the first person I ever, maybe I'm wrong, but I think he was the first person who ever did that.
Right.
You know, when you think about that sort of stuff, that changes our expectations of play. Where if I kill you, I lose access to a weapon. If I kill you again, I lose the next one. I'm down to an axe, and I'm chasing all the good guys are chasing the bad guy. You know, the newbies with axes. The newbies get to have the massive rocket launcher and so on. So that turn around, the natural thing. If I win, I get better things. Is actually a really powerful way of thinking in terms of design,
Mhm.
because you're putting experience. I know I'm wettering on it, but the other part of this is exchange. So a lot of designers are thinking about, what am I going to get for money? What are the forms of exchange is a separate conversation to what you get. So spending time playing the game, the grind of the game, is a form of exchange. Watching an ad is a form of exchange. Spending IAP one-off payments is a form of exchange. Having a VIP subscription is a form of exchange. In the past, inviting my friends to a game was a form of exchange, but then that got very bad. You know, selling your friends for resources in a game is not something I recommend. Bad thing. But you see what I mean? It's like, if we stop thinking about it just about money and think about what it is to be a player,
Mhm.
and what does the player value, and realizing that if we basically undermine skill, we undermine the whole game. If we undermine, you know, the time spent in the game, in playing the game, we've undermined the whole game.
Mhm.
So we've got to keep
I mean,
core the gamer's experience.
that last one, that last one is interesting. I think the idea of, like, time. If we undermine time spent in the game, then we're undermining the game as a whole.
Yeah.
Your kind of shortcuts rewards, there's an argument, do that somewhat.
Well, that's a complicated one, isn't it? Because a shortcut to me could be a power up, it could be a better weapon, it can be better armor.
Mhm.
And again, this is where game balance is a really key thing. So one of the things we do when we're doing game, so if you hadn't guessed, I don't just write books. We do this as a professional thing. You may have worked that out by now, but what we do, and actually we teach people to do it as well. You know, and again, hopefully you've got the aim here, as I'm not just the twirly moustached evil guy from a 1930s black and white movie, tying maidens to railway tracks or whatever.
Wow.
But But what we're trying to get people to understand is that there's ethical consequences. In fact, I did a talk at GDC in 2015 about the responsibility we have in free-to-play design to players.
Yeah.
So this is long before it became an issue about loot crates and stuff like that. The point is that we do have a responsibility, particularly for vulnerable people, to be reasonable. The trouble is, a lot of people assume we can also manipulate. And yes, we can once or twice, but you know what it does? We get with Star Wars Battlefront 2 kind of stories.
Alienates.
We get to the point where people blame the whole of live ops because a few bad actors have done some terrible things. And live ops is something which is about making games available that you love for longer. That's what it is. It's not about manipulating you out of your money, but it costs us money to do that. We've got to have a commercial incentive to be able to do it. That's not saying we want to exploit anybody,
Mm-hmm.
but it is an important part of making games that we will have a return for that, in the same way that you'd expect a guitarist to be paid for being a session musician or being part of a band. That you expect a painter to get paid for their work. I mean, I think our work is art, is value, is commercial. I think it's okay to be that. It's okay to accept that. It's not okay to ignore the player.
Yeah. I mean, you've kind of summarized it very nicely there, I'd say. I think as with all things, it's not what you're doing, it's how you're doing it. And that's the nuts and bolts of this whole discussion.
So we're having the Bananarama conversation. It's not what you do, it's the way that you do it. And that's what gets results. I'm showing my age there, aren't I?
Bananarama, that is a throwback. That is a throwback.
That's a throwback.
Yeah.
Every time someone says that, though, it just goes off in my head. I'm not so old. But yes, I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, again, I think we actually have a massive problem here. That as a games industry, we are often at the forefront of a lot of social anguish. So if you think about, the 80s, 90s, we were blamed for gun violence.
Okay, yeah, I see.
We were, and so is heavy metal, so is Marilyn Manson. Although Brian's a bit more complicated now. I understand. I'm not going to go into any whys and wherefores on these things. The point is, though, if you look at the analysis of gun crime over time versus game playing over time, there is an inverse correlation between games and gun violence. Just so you know. Now, we've also, I think that people have understood that, and the meta-analysis has demonstrated it's not our fault. I mean, don't get me wrong, we are part of the world culture. Of course, we're going to be part of the whole process. At the end of the day, though, we've seen people move away from that, and now we're starting to be tagged alongside gambling. And it doesn't stack up from an evidence point of view. So at the moment, this is why I'm so frustrated with the loot box argument, because I don't mind people blaming loot boxes as a bad design. That's fine. I agree that's probably the case in a lot of cases. The issue, though, is when you're selling a randomized set of stuff that again can be exchanged for somebody else, so that you've got a payoff for the thing that you've got. That's the issue. Even then, there are plenty of experts who would say that's not gambling, and I would tend to agree with them. But if you are creating a dependency moment, what is that as a behavior?
So, sorry, I'm just trying to formulate a view on this. But what you were saying is that if there's a payoff at the end, that makes it. You think that makes it worse, basically?
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, the important thing is I don't personally think it becomes gambling per se.
Yeah.
But I can kind of have sympathy
for those
people who find that problematic. And I know, so one of the issues is the World Health Organization have created a principle called gaming disorder, I think it is. I might be wrong on the wording on that. I can't remember. It's been a while since I checked it out. Now, so what they're essentially doing is they're putting in documentation, in formalizing the idea that a behavioral addiction is specifically tied to games. Whereas the previous literature, from my understanding, and I am not a psychologist, so do not take my word for it, but literally, I always say this to people: go find out for yourself. But the previous documentation was more about, there was a principle called behavioral addiction, which is different from physiological addiction. With gambling, there is a clear, measurable, evidence-based response, physical response to gambling behavior. There is a physiological factor. With behavioral addictions, it's not usually a physiological factor. The particular vehicle of your addiction, again, this is me being as a non-expert saying this, so please, if there are experts out there, please happily correct me. I am always interested in being informed. But the point is that as I understand it, the things like Facebook, sex addiction, workaholism, all these kind of things, and games are vehicles, the kind of crutch which people use that are the outcome of that behavioral addiction. I'm wording it terribly, so apologies to any psychologists there. But the point is that I think there's a physiological difference, in my understanding, between gambling, alcoholism, and those kind of addictions, drugs, etc., and these behavioral models. And the problem we have at the moment is that I think that we are, and this is not just my opinion, by the way, there are lots of psychologists out there who are saying similar things. There is a current correlation where we're trying to label games as the problem, and I think it's undermining our ability to deal with an underlying issue about how human beings have and respond to behavioral addictions.
Okay.
So I think it helps up to loot crates because if you look at the pattern of, I have to buy these things to be socially accepted in order to get this other set of things, like skins or whatever, or it might be power-ups, or it might be special unique weapons, whatever it might be, gacha-like models.
Mm-hmm.
If that's happening and people are feeling like they are compelled to do so, and there is a payoff, namely you can resell it, we're starting to enter more complicated territory. That's what I'm saying.
I think that is, yeah, okay. I find that interesting. I think that there's definitely a debate to be had about to what extent randomized rewards that are purchased with money is or is not gambling.
Yeah.
And I also think that there's an extra discussion to be had about, I think a lot of the big hoo-ha related to this is how it's exposed to children.
And again, that's the responsibility that we have as you. So again, let's take another thing. So personally, I think randomized rewards are fun and fantastic, but as part of gameplay.
Yeah.
I personally don't particularly like randomized rewards that come through purchase, but if you're completely transparent about the declaration of what the payoff chances are, if I'm going to have, say, for example, 14% of your booster pack are going to be uncommon, rare, common cards.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter to me that the specific uncommon, rare, common cards may vary.
Yeah.
As long as they're genuinely balanced, I think it's probably okay. But it's problematic because we're now making this really complicated discussion about the topic of what is randomized, what is acceptable, what's fun. And my worry is we end up having the wrong conversation. We end up having a conversation which could be misconstrued about any kind of in-app purchase. Okay. So that's when I get worried, because I think I think just as we have bad actors in the games industry, and there's no question we have had bad actors in the games industry, we often have bad actors in the even calling them bad actors makes me feel kind of a bit uneasy. Just have people with different agendas, and so for some people, games are an easy vehicle to resolve a different agenda, because it tends to be slightly younger, although it's not true anymore. There's a perception that we're a slightly younger audience, and there is a perception of rejection amongst some communities over what games can be.
Yeah, I just to leap in there, I think I very recently started on the 1st of September and a few weeks before locally, the new Disney trading card game was released, Lorcana. I've been playing it, great game, love it, enjoying it. But I love trading cards. I love trading
Yeah.
card games. I've played them since I was very young. I've bought booster packs since I was very young.
Yeah.
And in pretty much every way, buying a trading card game booster pack equates to buying a loot box in FIFA or in whatever it might be, COD or whatever it is. And clearly, in a trading card game context, it's societally acceptable because all of these games target
Physical
children.
delivery, fine. They're
Yeah.
all kids focused.
I
Well, not
think-
all. There are a couple of exceptions. Magic the Gathering is arguably more broad, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think that clearly there is, clearly there's a separation, or maybe a confusion, or maybe, as you've kind of alluded to, like a crossover from other areas. That is, why is it so much of a bigger deal in video games? And maybe it's a part of like an accessibility question of like it's very easy to spend a lot of money doing this thing in a video game, compared to, or not. I don't know. I think there's a wider discussion there, but it does kind of highlight how clearly games are viewed in a very specific way culturally, or video games specifically are viewed in a very specific way culturally, and there's challenges that come with that maybe other facets of games and entertainment haven't really had to face, which is, I think, what you were kind of saying.
Well, I mean, literally, this is a really key point, and I think probably the easiest area of argument are an audience that believe that physical goods have a higher value inherently than digital goods. In fact, that audience often thinks that digital goods have no value. And then the rest of us who consider digital goods to be a thing, I think that when I get a music track that actually I don't tend to buy music because I have to admit I'm a fully Spotified up person for the last few decades. But anyway, once upon a time I used to buy digital music. That was fine. I own those tracks. Well, I have a license for those tracks, slightly different. More important than we maybe understand how different that is, but that's the whole court case thing going on. I think, is that still going on, or is that resolved? I can't remember. Anyway, the point is that there is an audience there's a dissonance amongst some audience people about digital versus physical. That's one layer of this. Another layer is that it's the cash out value. So trading card games don't work, in my opinion, if there's no randomization. Because how are you going to trade?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of an example that breaks that, but for the most part, I can't.
There are deck building games that are not trading card games.
Yeah, there's like living card games that aren't quite as well. But for the most part, yes, inherently it's
no
hard.
Scarcity, there's no value. So, I mean, again, to my mind, it's about us understanding, again, what the player value is and how we deliver that authentically. And again, having a good understanding what the value is and respect for the audience, I think, is a really key part of this. So that's why and it's not just kids, it's vulnerable people in general, presenting them with a clarity over what they're getting is really important. And what does the loot box recommendations and legislation say? Tell people what they're going to get. Do you know what? That's massive. Also, give them an opportunity to break out of the experience. So what I mean by that is if you churn people through a split series, keep them playing, keep them locked in, and you don't give them moments where they can stop and reflect, that is a massive problem in terms of essentially how we're driving the experience. So we have, as designers, to build in these moments of self-reflection, because actually that's what's going to give people the best chance to not become absorbed too greatly in the game, but also stop them from running away from us, because often you'll find that people who don't get to break out burn out. So it's actually in our interest as designers to be reasonable to players in the sense of telling them what they want, because you tell them they can trust you more. If they trust you more, that's a much bigger driver for revenue than randomization.
Mm-hmm.
And then secondly, to be able to give them time to refresh and rethink. And if you've given them a good experience when they refresh and reflect, they want to play it again.
Yeah.
So I think that it's not just a question of ethics. And yes, there are ethical questions. It's actually a question of just good faith with players. And if we breach that good faith, we end up with worse experiences. We end up with people annoyed at us, and we end up with whole genres being bitched about as being evil, when actually it was a couple of people who well, maybe a few more than a couple, but there were certain people who didn't keep the faith with the player.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good rounding off point, to be honest, which is think about players. Yeah.
I mean, come on. I mean, how dare you say that? I mean, players. I mean, what do we care about them?
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's a good rounding off point, and I think we've covered a lot in terms of exploring some of the facets of monetization and why people might be feeling the way they feel, and what designers can think about to try and avoid the mistakes that have been made in the past, and maybe this whole gambling in games as a whole. I think there's probably a very big discussion to be had.
I could have a whole podcast on that conversation. I have actually launched a gambling service, never again. I learned so much, but I do not. Mostly that I don't ever want to do it.
Okay, well, there's definitely a talk in that, a podcast episode in that at least. But I guess we'll call it there, and say, Oscar, would you like to share anything you're doing, where people can find you if they don't know already? I mean, you're a staple of the podcast.
Yeah, well, I've been around everywhere. I'm going to be at PGC Helsinki by the time this goes out, probably. But I typically talk about my Twitter handle, but I kind of don't use it anymore. It is the X social platform, and it's so well named. But I am easily found on LinkedIn. I'm easily found by Googling. I am a CEO of a game publisher called Fundamentally Games. We publish under the title Jetpack Collective. We have our first games coming out later this year, and we've got some really cool stuff happening around a deck building game, a beautiful cozy adventure game, a lovely pets merge game that we're working on, and a bunch of others as well. So we work on a lot of games, and fundamentally you'll see me, actually there's a pun there, you'll see me somewhere else on the podcast. Bad pun.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. I'm Gianluca Montague. You can find me on X, I guess, and on LinkedIn under just my name, Gianluca Montague. And yeah, thank you for listening. We will see you next time.
Like, subscribe, all the usual stuff.
Do all the usual things.